the neutronic constraints that are geometric in nature cannot be overcome by factory production. There, you will never be able to make a neutronically efficient tiny reactor that, if you just build a bunch of them, is cheap. Because I mean, what you'll end up doing is you'll end up bringing them all close together, so the neutrons that leak out of one go into the other, and pretty soon you have a big reactor like that. That is a key fundamental neutronics issue that I don't care how many factories and how much modularization you've done, you're not getting around that. It's a truly geometric issue.
Welcome back to Decouple. Today I'm thrilled twice in 1 week, Nick Touran. Thrilled to have Nick back on the podcast for a, what do you call this? Like a double header? I don't know the sports terminology.
I guess double header, yeah. Not quite a
double header. So, you've done the hat trick. So this is number 4. Nick, I'm super excited about today's episode. We are going to be talking about microreactors today. And the reason that this sort of has been at, in the front of my mind, I just got back from Australia. I was down chatting with some folks there, the Minerals Council. And we're talking about the nuclear ban. And obviously, things are very political down there. The kind of upcoming election is not purely a nuclear energy election. There's a cost of living crisis as there is everywhere else. But energy is big there because electricity costs have been going up and nuclear is on the agenda. In any case, there was, some conversation where, one of the visions of the mining industry there is we can just sort of, I don't want to oversimplify and misquote this person, but basically, we can just run a lot off of microreactors, which that's certainly one of the applications we hear about. Remote mining operations, fly-in diesel, fuel security is a big problem at some of these sites in Canada. Powering remote communities. There's a commitment from the Trudeau government to have all native reserves and northern, remote communities off fossil fuels by 2035. Some nice wishful thinking, but microreactors are, something that's been discussed in terms of stepping in to fill the void. And as with, all things nuclear, the narratives are either super scary if you're thinking about weapons, or super, super exciting in terms of all of the potential swap-ins that are available. And just to finish out this diatribe, another thing I'm really noticing is amongst the climate concerned folks, there's a desire to find, swap in for fossil fuel services, right? And I mean, that's a desire I share, but I think sometimes that leads to some creative thinking when it comes to, obviously the Ford Nucleon, the idea of a nuclear powered automobile did not come to fruition. Similarly, we talked a little bit in our last episode about the aircraft reactor experiment. We're not powering planes with nukes. We have found niche applications, but we'll see. We'll talk a bit today about the role for microreactors, whether it's niche, whether it's more widespread. Obviously, a lot of talk about data centers maybe being powered with microreactors. Anyway, this introduction has gone on far too long. First off, Nick, welcome back. It's been a while.
Yeah, it's been so long. Yes, I'm very happy to be back. This is a great conversation topic. I'm really excited to dive into it. I mean, you're right. The excitement and the capability around what nuclear can do in microreactor type environments is, I think, very hot right now. There's lots of companies, there's lots of money. It's really interesting. There's a great, interesting history about it. And it is one of the sort of things that nuclear can technically do. I mean, it has this high energy density, and that is very capable in certain situations. And so thinking about sort of what it takes, what we've done in the past, what the challenges are, and going through various options and examples, I think will be really interesting for everybody. So happy to be back.
Maybe we should just define some terms first. So small modular reactors become a little bit of a grab bag for everything that's not a conventional sort of gigawatt scale reactor. We have Rolls-Royce coming in with a 470 megawatt reactor. And we have, I think, Last Energy's 20 megawatt reactor. Probably there's a consensus that's more on the microreactor side. Just kind of rapid fire questions. What are we talking about in terms of microreactors, in terms of power output, or how do you define them?
Yeah, I think a good definition for microreactors is to just use power level, and less than 10 megawatts electric is a pretty good standard microreactor definition. I think is fairly reasonable consensus. That's micro, and it's changed a bunch of times through different programs, but right now I think micro less than 10 million watts is a pretty reasonable thing to say. And there's different classes within there for different use cases, but that's reasonable. Small modular reactor, yeah, it's all over the place. I mean, the original intent, I think, was to sort of have this idea of, you factory fabricate modules, you deliver them to site, and you assemble them, and that would be the concept of a small modular reactor. But it's expanded far beyond that, largely because it became an interesting term. People wanted small modular reactors, and so everybody said like, well, mine's a small modular reactor. Of course it's small modular. And I mean, even AP1000 has elements of modular construction, but it's not small. But is it a large modular reactor? Still, you're doing all sorts of site prep and all kinds of things. So the term SMR has become almost meaningless. You're right, it's just less than a gigawatt. But microreactor is still more well defined. It's less than 10.
And when I talk to policymakers, the narrative that they've been sold by the trade associations and a lot of the vendors is I build my reactor in a factory, highly productive environment. This is kind of like, I'm grabbing at Tesla here as an example. But anyway, something that's highly manufactured. I ship it to your site. I snap it together like Lego and I plug it into the grid. I hear that far too often for my own comfort. But what we've talked a lot in this podcast about grid scale SMRs, the kind of 300 megawatt size, and how that really doesn't apply in terms of how the civil works still drive a huge amount of the construction cost, and they don't scale down proportionately to the power output. So often proportionately in a lot of these designs, you actually do more on-site stick-built construction because of the necessity for seismic category 1 foundations, etc. So I think that some of the hype about microreactors is like, well, actually, these are what I just described there. These, build in a factory, drive to site, snap
plug
together
them
like
in.
Lego.
Yeah, it's shown on many of their websites. Like it's just a truck rolling up, legs go down, the truck drives off, and you run a wire to it. Like that's what people are selling right now. And there's some complexities there. We've tried to do stuff like that, but like when you start talking about shielding requirements and so on, there's some challenges. I mean, again, an interesting concept, but like, we can dive into like shielding in particular is like a good thing to talk about.
Yeah. Maybe before we do. So, shielding, fuel economy, fuel availability, maintenance requirements, et cetera. I think we're going to get into all of those sort of challenges that I think you and I have been sort of chattering about on the sidelines. But before we do, what's old is new. When we did a Rickover episode last week, we were talking about Farrington Daniels high temperature gas reactor as one of the first attempts at a power reactor that Rickover sort of swept aside. But also, that's a reactor that's prominent right now with X Energy. Ultrasafe Nuclear Corporation was also pursuing a high temperature gas reactor. So, those are considered cutting edge, but actually were some of the first iterations and attempts. But, if we're defining microreactors kind of less than 10 megawatts, there's a rich history. And one is, the Army Nuclear Power Program, military microreactors, which I'm looking forward to going into.
Yeah.
I guess another is prototype reactors. I'm thinking about, with my maple syrup, patriotic stained chest here, the nuclear power demonstration reactor, about 20 megawatts, and a lot of, borax, et cetera. A lot of sort of prototypes were in that size range. And lastly, research and isotope production reactors. Those would all fit within those sizes. So, how do you want to take this? I think like what's currently being talked about is probably more relevant to the kind of military program that we have. Like we could probably go into too much detail if we start talking about prototypes and research reactors.
Yeah, there have been hundreds of small reactors. I think it's probably valuable to describe small reactors for things that had purposes that were either prototypic or research or some other kind of experiment. But there were also really a lot of interesting, very small reactors that were intended for power production or remote power that didn't make it for various reasons. We can talk about those, some very exotic ones as well as more typical ones like you listed. But I think, like a microreactor brand is really intended to be like a diesel generator replacement. Like it's going to do what we said. It's going to roll in, you're going to drop it off. It's going to provide remote power reliably in some remote location or elsewhere for a long time. I think that's a reasonable way to differentiate it from like all the hundreds of small reactors. Like, there's this great database that the IAEA maintains called like the Research and Test Reactor Database, or Research RRDB, I think it is. Anyway, they have like 800 or 900 different reactors of different sizes that have operated. So we won't be able to go through all those. But yes, we have certainly built lots of very small reactors in the past, all over the place.
Notably, none have been commercial, however.
That's
to my knowledge.
Yeah, that's reasonable.
Some have been grid connected, like the world's first grid connected nuclear reactor in Russia. What was that again? It was the AM1. I'm not going to try and show off my freshly minted short term memory for the night before the exam cram on microreactors.
Yeah.
I just did, but yeah. So just again, before I think we should dive in probably to the Army nuclear power program
Yeah.
as a good, again, a lot of the use cases that are being described for microreactors are these kind of remote applications. As I said,
Sure.
mining folks interested. We'll talk maybe a little bit more about the feasibility of data center with massive loads maybe later, but let's focus there. But before we do, one more sort of broad thematic thing I wanted to touch on is, again, just thinking about like the diesel engine and how you have marine diesel engines powering very large container ships. We're talking like 100 megawatts, and we have like 5 kilowatt home diesel generators to power the cottage or something when the lights go out. There are challenges, at that scale, and also at the 18-wheeler or the whatever the diesel cars they were so fond of in the EU for a while.
Yeah.
But like across those wide varieties of scale, there's challenges, but at every scale they are economic and commercially widely deployed. And I think that's where I think there's probably a bit of a category error to say that, hey, if you can do it with diesel engine, why is a nuclear reactor different? And we in terms of just understanding how human beings incorporate new information, we really rely on mental models. And we have an existing mental model, and that might be things we're familiar with, an availability bias towards something like a diesel engine or a diesel generator. And then we try and slot new information in. So we say, hey, nuclear, I mean, it produces electricity, sounds like a diesel generator. And I think my hope with this discussion is to really get into the nuance there and figure out what some of those key differences are so we can, enrich those mental models. So
And diesel generators are quite the nice technology, but they have major downsides. You have to be delivering fuel. They have particulate and climate challenges and so on. So yeah, I think it's really worth describing that. And okay, so we'll go into the Army reactors, but really, I just want to do one thing on shielding first, because let's talk about like a home generator. So I just want to go through like a little bit of a thought experiment with shielding, because one of the things that drives me the most crazy is like images of reactors with a person standing next to it with no shielding whatsoever. Every company does this. Everyone who's promoting reactors always does this. There's never shielding, and that's a big mistake. Going back to Rickover, he said, respect even very small amounts of radiation. And there's a reason he said that. I just want to go through this briefly, and then we'll go into the Army reactors, if that's okay. So imagine, units of radiation are hard to understand and nobody really understands them, but just like we'll use millisieverts. Millisieverts is a measure of basically how much energy from radiation is deposited in your body. So it's like joules per kilogram of mass. And the more energy deposited in your body, the more biological damage can happen. So we all get like 6 millisieverts per year from natural and normal medical procedures. If you do like a total body irradiation, if you have really bad cancer, you might get like 5,000 millisieverts, which is very high. In fact, 4,000 is like the human LD50 without medical intervention. So if you get 4,000 right away, like you'll probably die unless you have medical intervention. So 6 is normal, 4,000 is deadly. And between 100 and 300 is where people start to see measurable increases in like a long-term cancer, small increases, but you can say like, if you get 100, you might get more cancer. So let's go to reactors. So like CP1 was the first reactor. It operated, it had no shield. It was just in the big room in the squash court. They could run it up to 2 watts, they thought, without a shield, without basically killing or hurting the operators. So if you
this is the Fermi pile?
Yes.
CP1?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah.
So
graphite blocks in a squash court.
Yeah, exactly. This is going to be grossly oversimplified, but it's just like take this for what it is. So that's like 2 watts. Not all of that comes out as radiation, obviously. A lot of it's deposited as heat, but like 2 watts is basically 30 millisieverts per second. If you just like do energy conversion stuff. And so some small fraction of that, if you're going to joules joules coming out per kilogram of person, if you're standing there. So that's like 30 millisieverts per second out of the whole room. And if you're standing next to it, you're only going to get like a fraction of that. But they knew they couldn't run above 2 watts for that. So they went to CP2, which went up to 2 kilowatts. So now if you're standing there, like just getting, if you're standing next to it, you could be getting up to like, again, super oversimplified, but 300 millisieverts per second is the kind of dose you could be getting just standing there next to it at 2 kilowatts. This is like
Wow.
a very 2,000 watts. And so your cancer is increasing every third of a second. You'll have a fatal dose in 13 seconds at 2 kilowatts. So what do? They put a 5-foot concrete shield. So you put even a tiny reactor needs to have like a 5-foot concrete shield. And yeah, there are different materials you can use, but like 5 feet of concrete is like a pretty good baseline. You can use higher density things and borated things and so on. But generally, you're going to need something like a 5-foot concrete shield if you're above like a few watts. There's another like great example of this like handheld size core. The Clementine core was this big. It was a weapons grade plutonium core. And it's just this little tiny thing. I love showing it because then when they show where they operated it very early, it was in 5-foot concrete shield surrounded all around it because it was a fast reactor. Neutrons are coming out, gamma's coming out. So you really like if you want to do something very small and have people anywhere near it, you need like a really big heavy shield. And there's a bunch of complications with that. You can like backfill with earth, but then it's going to get activated, and we'll talk about that. But just the shielding alone is like a major difference between like a generator that you can just start up in your house and like a nuclear reactor. And that's why like the nucleon doesn't exist, because you just can't put 5-foot concrete shields around
in a car.
Around a car. Yeah. And so anyway, it's just something to really keep in mind. I don't think people respect shielding. I never see shielding. I need to see shielding shown in reactor renders before I basically judge people. I'm like, okay, they are not serious because there's no shield. Like that's sort of my bias. Anyway, so that's my like shielding diatribe.
Yeah, and I mean, you've opened the Pandora's box here. We won't go all the way in because hopefully we'll get more into a shielding section. But one thing that kind of leaps out at me, and like having visited a number of gigawatt scale plants, is the shielding. There can be sort of internal shielding and external shielding, but when you're dealing with a microreactor, there's not room necessarily, in terms of separating all the systems to put a whole big chunk of shielding in. So it's I think you're doing the shielding more just kind of on the outside of the thing, which probably makes getting in and doing maintenance, if you have to, a little bit tricky.
Yes, maintenance is hard because of shielding. And also things you have to worry about in shielding besides activation are like if there's a tube with coolant going in it, well, the radiation can stream through that tube. So you have to worry about streaming effects. People make like labyrinth type shields. But yeah, the idea of like how to remove, how to open it, how to get in there. That one of the reactors we'll talk about that the Army ran, the truck mounted one, they like built up earth around it and they made people stay 500 meters away. Nobody could go within 500 meters of it, even though it was this little tiny truck mounted reactor, even with earth and shields. It was like, and this is in the early 60s where, people in the military, they still had strict radiation standards, but like you couldn't go within 500 meters of that thing when it was operating.
And we're not talking, I mean, we can leave the L&T discussion aside, but we're talking about like significant doses. This isn't just like, shielding if you don't care, if you believe in the threshold, it's not a big deal. This stuff will kill you if it's not adequately shielded.
Yes. I mean, you could argue that you could get closer than 500 and they have, stringent radiation standards in the military, even in the 60s, as we sort of talked about with Rick Over. But like, yeah, it's serious. Like, it's not just like, don't worry about it. Like it's actual. I mean, again, you're going to be getting increased cancer in seconds standing outside one of these things. Unshielded. I mean, and you'll get fatal dose in seconds if you're right next to it unshielded. Yeah, so radiation is a big difference. All right, let's
we talk about sort of like nuclear renaissances. We've had a few, but I think we could maybe say this is like the second age of the microreactor. And if we're talking again about sort of like the Army nuclear power program or the Soviet equivalent, or sort of 1950s to 70s, I guess. Powering some fascinating places.
Oh, yeah.
The secret, like this is like Dr. Evil stuff, like a secret base under an ice sheet, Antarctica. Let's dive in.
All right. So these reactors are, one thing you got to say about microreactors is like every microreactor that operated in the past, I'm like obsessed with them. It's so cool. Like they did this stuff in this crazy place and it went up and running and there's this great video about it. So yeah, I kind of first heard about military microreactors through this Army nuclear power program through an old film that I saw on YouTube that's like about Camp Century. It's the Camp Century film that is this ice base in Greenland where the army basically trucked all these components out. They built an ice base in Greenland. They trenched out these huge trenches and they put a nuclear reactor in there and they fired it up and that thing powered the base. And it's such a cool film. They show the construction and there's a little dog named Muckluck who's like their mascot. It's really a great 30-minute documentary about that thing. And I was just like, wow, that is so cool. And then learning more about it, you start learning that, oh, there were a whole bunch of these. The Army, and this is very early on. This is before any real power reactors were up and running commercially or anything. The Army, having seen what the Navy was doing with the submarines, the Army was like, we need these for remote stations. Like, this will be great. We'll get rid of our diesel logistics, we'll reduce costs, it'll be reliable, blah, blah, all the things you hear today. And so they went and they built, the first one they built was actually in Virginia. It's called the SM-1. It was a small, highly enriched uranium pressurized water reactor. So kind of based on what was going on in the Navy. And that thing was used to train people. I got a film digitized specifically about that particular reactor. As everyone knows, I like to digitize old films. And I have 4 new ones coming out soon. I'm going to go pick them up today. But anyway, so that thing was fired up on a base, and they used it to train people to learn the procedures and so on. So that was kind of the leader. And then they went ahead and put one in. I mean, we talked about Camp Century. That was the PM2A. They did PM3A, which was in Antarctica at McMurdo Station. That was an Air Force one that powered this station in Antarctica for a long time, between like 62 and 67 or so. There was one in Wyoming that powered a radar station called PM1. These have all been pressurized water reactors, small PWRs, all like 2 megawatts ish. So PM1, and all the numbers mean stuff. Portable, medium. So first letter, it's either stationary S, portable P, or M for mobile. So like can move around while it's operating. Portable means you can airlift it. PM1, I always tell the story, like it was assembled it was built in a factory, assembled, tested at the factory, disassembled, loaded into 17 C-130 shipping containers, flown all the way to Wyoming, actually I think Montana, and then trucked up the mountain in Wyoming, and then reassembled and turned on. And it was totally, it had no water cooling. It was an air-cooled reactor, so because there's no water supply in these remote areas. And that thing powered and heated that radar station for some time. So that's a cool one. There's one in Alaska. There was at Fort Greely. There was a floating one built on a barge that powered a part of the Panama Canal. That's the MH-1A. And there were some that weren't ever built, like PL-1 and PL-2. Those were going to be built in Alaska. And then the infamous SL-1, stationary low power one, was an Army reactor, BWR, that suffered the catastrophic accident that's killed the 3 operators. That I think most people know that story about SL1. That was part of this Army program as well. So those are all military microreactors. Oh, and I forgot, sorry, the best one is ML1, the truck-mounted military microreactor, which is a pretty exotic reactor. It was water-cooled, but it had nitrogen gas coolant that went to a closed Brayton cycle power cycle. I think it's the only reactor that's ever actually operated on a Brayton cycle. I've been trying to find other ones, but that was like the smallest and most portable and kind of coolest one. We've all seen the picture of like this truck driving around in the sagebrush in Idaho. So that was part of it as well. And so those were all super cool, interesting reactors, and every single one of them shut down basically for maintenance, operation, and economics reasons, like the military, and a severe accident that, violently pinned a guy to the roof with a control rod. That was a gruesome accident. So they all mostly had like economic issues, and then one bad accident. But still, I mean, people were saying it wasn't that like this is a terrible idea forever. It's kind of like these have maintenance challenges, and there's lots of lists of what those were. This could be done, but like it needs to be done differently. Basically, was the conclusion. Like, we're not interested right now, and they shut them all down. Went back to oil and diesel.
And I mean, I have to say, like having lived in the far north and in the Arctic, being powered in parts by fossil fuels, whether it's heating oil or, my snow machine, running on fossil fuels. I mean, these are miraculous substances. And when you're in the far north, the communities like this used to be kind of Inuit moving around nomadically, low population density. And now, as a result of a whole bunch of different historical factors, you have these concentrated communities that are kind of like moon bases. Like there's not a way in which they can sustain themselves from local resources, particularly energetically. Like there's this one flying community, and when you fly in, there's this town. It's not a it's not high rises or anything, right? It's just it's a little town, and they have been cutting firewood around the community, and the soil is very sandy there. And once you actually log, particularly if you kind of like clear cut log, it becomes a desert. And so in the summer, if you fly over this place, you have this little community, and 5 kilometers out is desert until you hit some boreal forest where they're continuing to cut firewood. Like these are not sustainable energetically, but for the use of concentrated fuel sources like fossil fuels. And yes, it is a pain in the butt to get heat oil in and to get diesel in, and ships get stuck in ice. And you have generators that break down, and you have fuel leaks, and you have the particulate pollution, as you mentioned. But I mean, bloody miraculous that these communities can exist in any way, shape, or form. And when I think about the success of the naval reactor program, which we talked about on our last episode about Rickover, I mean, you had a niche application and a use case that there was no substitute for. There's no other power source that can take you underwater to circumnavigate the globe, for instance, right? But there was, as inconvenient as some of the things I just described are, diesel and heating oil are pretty goddamn amazing and can power and have powered remote sites, for many decades. So that's what kind of strikes me, is that there wasn't a niche case where the alternative was so difficult or frankly impossible. And so the Army, never really ended up, going all in on this technology. And you mentioned the US. I was just reading about the Soviets and this kind of tracked vehicle based portable reactor they had. I mean, can you describe that one quickly? Because I thought that was really cool.
Oh, yeah. I've only seen, I haven't found too many details on that thing. I've seen, the pictures of it, but I can't really remember. I mean, my understanding of that is that, yeah, they built, a huge land train type of thing and operated it, but, it was super slow, super heavy, and, they quickly, realized it was a bad idea. And the U.S. did have something similar that was planned. We had this thing called the military compact reactor, which got super exotic in design, but it was supposed to be a land train as well. They eventually switched it over to be something that would produce ammonia and hydrogen to power from air. It would suck in air, make ammonia, make hydrogen for fuel cells. Ammonia could be burned in internal combustion engine. And that was the plan, to have this energy depot type thing that I think was sort of the competition with the Soviet thing, where they actually built and ran that thing, at least briefly. It's stupidly large and heavy because they put shielding because they wanted people to actually be around it. But yeah, I mean, the diesel thing, it's certainly in submarines, it's very a step change in capability, and that's, I mean, it's still interesting. The fuel price is high in some of these remote areas, and so if you're going to develop a microreactor, it's going to be more expensive. But if you can, to have it as a target to sort of be able to meet diesel is it's a reasonable target. It's an interesting market as a place to start. It's who's going to pay a premium for the early versions of the reactors that I want to develop. I mean, I think there's a logic to it. It's a reasonable goal. But you're right, it's a challenging goal because there is this alternative that's kind of working. And I mean, so it's even more of an interesting goal when you talk about for military purposes, because the military is saying sure, they can use oil, but they have major logistical challenges that are very serious when you get into enemy territory. And we're in a situation, the story where, most of the fatalities, 50% of the U.S. military fatalities in recent hostile areas have come from attacks on the logistical chain, like RPGs shooting the oil convoys. And so if you can just get rid of those convoys, well, you can save all those lives. And you also don't have to worry about getting cut off from your supply chain, your oil supply chain, if you're off doing some kind of operations in some forward operating location. So there is a true sort of military strategic major advantage if you can get this high power sort of portable thing that can be cut off from that. So again, that's that's close to a submarine step change in capability. So it's I mean, there's certainly like an argument there, but then I mean, yeah, everything that would change with how much conflict we're involved in, and that would also change with like um, just the cost. Like, what's the cost premium where people are going to say like, "Yep, that's good, let's do it," versus, "I'm sorry, that's far too expensive, and I cannot handle it." And so, like, that's the challenge.
I guess the one thing is that your shielding then becomes a dual purpose technology because, it could also block projectiles,
Yeah,
right? If you
exactly.
need
Yeah,
to
yeah,
put in
exactly.
five meters of concrete or whatever it was.
Exactly. If someone's going to be shooting RPGs at it, then yeah, they
So
can.
a few more, I guess, kind of commonalities of what we'll call, the first microreactor renaissance or whatever it was. Um, these are almost all PWRs, and they're almost all running on highly enriched uranium. You mentioned there's a couple exotic reactors mixed in the bunch there, but that fuel choice is interesting. And I think maybe we talked a bit about shielding, and I'm sure we'll dive in a bit deeper, but maybe let's use that as a jumping off point to talk about the challenges of neutron economy and why HEU is used, in these military reactors, and we'll probably get into some of the kind of modern contenders in terms of the second potential microreactor renaissance, where a lot of them are using at least high assay, low enriched uranium. So why was the choice there for HEU? And let's talk neutron economy, Nick.
Sure, that's my original specialty. So that's what I went to school for. Yeah, so I mean, they used ATU because they were the army, they were military, they had access to it, and if you use ATU, you can make a very small system that can sustain a chain reaction. If you go to lower enrichment, you get more neutron leakage. As the neutrons are bounced around, they reach a surface easier and they leak out. And so you have to become bigger to change your surface area to volume ratio, and then you can still make a critical reactor, but you need to go. It has to be bigger. So to do these really compact things where space really mattered, HEU is a sure thing. Like, it's the obvious choice. If all you care about is getting like a small thing that's going to run for a long time at high power. That's the other thing. Like, you may be able to make a lower enriched uranium, or you have to have a certain amount of neutron economy uh, beyond just critical in order to run for some time. Because as you're splitting those atoms, two things are happening, right? You're getting rid of your fuel, so that reduces reactivity, the ability to sustain a chain reaction. And you're also building up fission products. When those uranium atoms split, they become these fission products, smaller atoms, many of which are very strong neutron absorbers. So you're building in neutron poisons and you're reducing the amount of fuel you have. And so that reduces your ability to sustain that chain reaction. So HEU helps you in sort of those two ways. It lets you be really small to start, and it lets you keep operating at high power for a long time.
And so just again, I think most listeners here are nuke nerds, but for those who aren't, just go into that a bit more detail, maybe with the illustrating it from the opposite perspective of having a great big like ABWR, like 1.5 gigawatt core, and just the journey of the neutron. Because someone was just explaining this to me, and they're like, yeah, it's not like the neutron buys a plane ticket and its destination is the next U-235 atom. Like, just in terms of the physics of what's happening, like the way these things are moving, it's crazy, right? Like, just nerd out a little bit more on that.
It's very crazy. So so neutrons. If you start with a neutron source, a neutron source is like the first neutron you introduce into the system. You do this you can take like an alpha emitter, like americium 241, and put it next to like a beryllium thing. When you bring those together, the alpha particles go into the beryllium, and there's a beryllium reaction that releases neutrons. So you have these. Anyway, there's numerous other ways to start it up, but now you have a free neutron. That neutron goes into the core and it just bounces around. It's going to bounce off an iron atom or whatever, whatever you have in that core, it's going to start bouncing off it. And there's different things that can happen. It can scatter, it can get captured by the atom, which will then go through a nuclear transformation and become, the atom with one more neutron, which then may be unstable and decay to some other atom through beta decay. Or if it gets absorbed in the uranium atom, especially uranium 235, there's this chance that it will fission the reactor or fission the atom, which is this sort of unique nuclear reaction that was discovered, in 1938. So now you can have neutrons that go in and actually split atoms. And then the cool thing about just splitting an atom is cool on its own, but it also emits two or three additional other free neutrons. And that's what lets you do the chain reaction, because now you've got one neutron in, a couple neutrons out. And if you put enough of those uranium atoms nearby, well, then the neutrons that come out they come out really fast and they start bouncing off things and they start slowing down. And eventually they may do a couple things. They may get absorbed by a neutron poison. They may get absorbed by structural atoms like iron. They may leak out the side of the reactor and disappear to be absorbed by something out there. They may get absorbed in uranium-238 and become plutonium. That could lead to like a breeder reactor. Or they might get absorbed in another uranium-235 atom, usually causing it to split. But sometimes if you get absorbed in a U-235, you just become uranium-236, which then, so there's all sorts of things that can happen. And I mean, can keep going. The probability of all those reactions is extremely dependent on the energy of the neutron. So when it comes out fast and then it slows down, the relative probability of all those different possibilities that can happen varies wildly by like 10 orders of magnitude. And there's crazy resonances. If you look at, there's these things we call cross sections. They're just plots of probability of a nuclear reaction as a function of energy. And as you go as a function of energy, it's like do, and then there's like a 5 order of magnitude spike that we call a resonance. And if you're just a little bit faster or slower, you're like 10,000 times more likely to get absorbed. And so we spend all this time measuring those values, and then we simulate them on computers and have analytic methods. But anyway, so
stepping away to my 30,000 foot non-specialist view here. Like a big core just means that, neutrons are precious because we need them to fission those 235s. And in a big core, they're going to have more opportunities to interact. In a small core, neutrons are going to leak more because, again, of that surface to volume ratio. Small volume, big surface. You're leaky. You lose neutrons, and then that's going to create issues for you in terms of, how much fuel you need, your refuelings, your enrichment levels, et cetera.
Yeah. Sorry, I went on yes, exactly.
No.
The size effect is just this leakage effect. It's literally like, okay, now if you're losing, 20% of your neutrons, those are neutrons that can't sustain your chain reaction, and so it's much harder to maintain that chain reaction at first and also through time. So yeah, the leakage effect from being small is the major effect.
So again, that's why most of the early designs were HEU, and now it's pretty hard to get your hands on HEU, highly enriched uranium.
Yeah.
Even the medical research reactors have mostly switched down to HALEU. HALEU we're pretty short on. We've covered this with James Krallenstein. Go back and check out the Enriching Uranium Understanding episode. It was great, beautiful history of centrifugation, gas diffusion, and really a bit of an indictment of our limited capabilities now, particularly in the U.S. Let's talk a little bit about ways to get around this poor neutron economy, whether it's HALEU, neutron, reflectors. Like, how can we manage this?
Yes, you make it a little as big as you can to fit in your space, and you go to as high enriched as you can within your legal and regulatory framework, which is what we call HALEU. I hate the name. I wish it were called medium enriched uranium. That would be a much better term, because then you don't have to explain. You're like, oh yeah, use this HALEU, which always is followed up by like, what the hell is HALEU?
What the hell? Yeah.
So it's like a worthless term. But medium enriched uranium, anybody can understand. But sadly, I haven't been able to make that popular. Anyway, so you go right up to that, which is 20% enriched is the limit. So you go 19.75 or whatever, to give yourself a little margin. And that's it. And then other things you can do. You mentioned you can put reflectors around that core. That'll help to a degree. There are materials that will send some of the neutrons as they're leaking. They may come bouncing back in if you use like a beryllium or magnesium oxide or other materials that just happen to have like a good anisotropic scattering, bring it on back. But still, like those it's not like you can't hug neutrons. They are still going to go out. A lot of them are going to go out. So you can get a little bit of a benefit from a reflector, but it's not going to be a major game changer. You will have a reflector, but it's not like that solves your neutron issue. And then
Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say the other thing we didn't talk about in the physics discussion was like moderators. So you generally want to have a moderated reactor in order to sort of keep your amount of fissile material low. Moderators, and we can talk about the physics, are like a magical thing that you can add to a reactor to make them much more efficient in terms of their chain reaction. Now, the smallest possible reactor is going to be a fast reactor because moderator takes space. But in terms of like fuel economy, getting the most power out in the smallest area with the lowest amount of fuel, then you're going to absolutely want a moderator. So most of the microreactors that are out there now, not all, but most of them are moderated reactors. And all of these military microreactors of the past, all of them were moderated.
But I'm thinking, I think eVinci and Oklo, are they both fast reactors?
Oklo is, and eVinci is not. eVinci is graphite moderated, is my understanding. It's kind of hard to find the specific details, but that's my understanding at least.
Right, right. And so let's just call it. Let's start a new fad: medium enriched uranium, aka HALEU. That's the decoupled term now. MEU, medium enriched uranium. Sounds like a cat. Meow.
Yeah.
So yeah, MEU. Costs, will eventually come down. But let's talk a little bit about, we know that the feedstock for MEU, for HALEU, is low enriched uranium. Luckily, you don't have to run it through centrifuges that much more because it, just by nature, it's not going to take as much work to get it up to 20 as it did to get it up to 3 to 5. That being said, we don't have a lot of LEU. Give me a sense of the current cost of HALEU, just as it is now. There's going to be a bit of a chicken and egg here in terms of increasing availability and increasing demand, but I want to get a sense of what it's going to cost to, say, fuel something like the eVinci.
Sure. So one thing we can do here is just say, there is a major premium on getting HALEU because there's no facilities licensed for it right now. So it's a special thing. You have to treat it specially. So there's a major cost premium over regular low enriched uranium to go HALEU. But let's just ignore that completely. Let's just worry about how many SWUs and how much feed uranium you have to do. And we can look at
costs. Is a separative work unit.
Yes. How much enrichment work you have to do and how much that costs for this kind of thing. And that way, it's going to be like a super low ball because we're just ignoring the cost premium on HALEU, which is huge. I mean, it's like at least factors of 5 or something like that right now. But as you said, it could come down. There's no reason we couldn't establish a huge industry of HALEU and get it going and bring the cost down to something back to whatever the enrichment and feed uranium costs. So now it is a little bit hard. So another trend that I hate is that nobody publishes detailed information about their core. And I get it. They don't want people to criticize them, but it's so stupid, especially if you're asking for public funding, which maybe these people aren't. We should demand that they list the basic characteristics of their system. I want to know, fuel basic quantities. I want to know the average discharge burn up to know how much fuel is being used. I want to know how much fissile material is in there, what enrichment it is, so that we can do actual economics assessments as a world and sort of be able to weigh things reasonably against each other. So eVinci, as far as I know, you pull their, and all the other companies, I don't mean to point out eVinci. Everybody does this. You go to the NRC and see their licensing submittals. They're all redacted. You can't see the damn thing about these reactors. So people in the literature have tried to do things where they say well, we don't really know what it looks like because we have no information. It's all proprietary. So let's just take what they've said, 5 megawatts electric, 8-year life, direct cycle heat pipes and so on. And let's build something in a simulation that basically meets those criteria. So you're basically guessing what the thing looks like and doing simulations to try to figure it out. So that's kind of the best we have. And I looked at a paper from Hernandez 2019 that James pointed me to, Penn State and Brookhaven, where they attempted, again, they don't know what eVinci looks like, but they took a reactor of that basic characteristics. They found it needed, at 19.75 enriched, it needed 4.6 tons of fuel to load into the core, which is, so we can cost that out, right? So just with basic cost assumptions, that's going to be something $45 million for the core, which is $9,000 per kilowatt for a 5 megawatt electric reactor. So the fuel alone is absurdly expensive for that kind of thing.
Right.
And I mean, right. there's major disadvantages.
That 9,000 a kilowatt is sort of is that your overnight construction cost?
That's just the fuel cost. That's just buying the cost. That's just buying the core to put you build it, but you've got your construction cost totally separate from this, which will be whatever it is, maybe really low because it's in a factory, whatever. But now you have a $9,000 per kilowatt charge for your fuel. So even if you can factory produce things for nothing, they could be absolutely free reactors, you still have to pay for fuel. And fuel at this scale is like absurdly expensive.
And fuel is a upfront capital cost compared to an amortized, put in
Yes.
diesel in the fuel
Yes,
tank
and that's
kind
a
of cost.
major challenge from the way economics is evaluated these days. If you have to buy 8 years of fuel up front with this very high cost, like that's fuel that if you look at an LCOE type model, well, buying diesel fuel for 5 years is vastly, it's all discounted out in the future. Because if you have to put that big investment here now, well, that's money you could have put in the stock market and it could be making all sorts of money for those 5 years. So to have to purchase a big chunk of expensive fuel and not get like not that much power out of it is a very significant economic disadvantage, especially from an LCOE point of view. And that's, yeah.
Can I toss a few numbers past you?
Yeah.
And I'm not sure how reliable they are, but
Okay.
In terms of current estimated costs for things like HALEU, TRISO, low enriched uranium, and CANDU fuel, what I've heard is something like for HALEU and TRISO, each, the range is probably like, again, my numbers, I really have to double check them here, like kind of $20,000 to $30,000 per kilo for HALEU and TRISO. And I don't get how that makes sense because you probably need to use HALEU to make the TRISO. So I imagine it's even more expensive. But anyway, let's say $20,000, $30,000 a kilogram. Low enriched uranium fuel, I think, is about $300 a kilogram. And good old CANDU fuel is basically just dirt. It's about $50 a kilogram. Do those numbers have a whiff of truthiness to them?
Yeah, that would be the 300 per kilogram is like, those are basically just fabrication costs. So that doesn't include the enrichment and feed uranium, at least on the low enriched uranium case, which I kind of know. So there's like the fabrication cost, which traditionally people have said for TRISO is 10,000 a kilogram. Like that's what it's been forever. That's just like given the enriched uranium, that's what it takes to like build those TRISOs. Now, yeah, so those numbers are kind of those are certainly along the lines of what I've heard. And like you can also point to reprocessed fuel, recycled fuel is up in that range too. EBR2 fuel is $50,000 a kilogram to recycle, but it's done in this very bespoke, not commercialized type way. So people say like, well, you could do it for 20,000. And then if you build big facilities for any of these things, like if you scale up a factory that does reprocessing or does TRISO fabrication, there are reasonable pathways to bring those fabrication costs down. And like that's one of the things UltraSafe that sadly just went bankrupt, but they were really focused on the process. They were modularizing TRISO fuel fabrication. They have a reactor concept, but they were really totally focused on developing like a cheaper way to fabricate TRISO in a way that sort of used economies of mass production. And I think they're making like real progress there. So I think it's fair to say that like, yes, they're super expensive now. Like you're not going to decarbonize with TRISO fuel right now, but there is potentially a pathway to bring the fabrication cost down.
Can you give me a sense, because you said the LEU, the kind of fuel manufacturing cost was $300 a kilogram.
Yeah, I think that's right.
What if you added in the enrichment cost? What do you think it would be total? Guesstimate. It's like 1,000.
Yeah, I should know this, but yeah, it'd be 300 fab. Is that right? I have all these numbers on my SWU calculator, but I like use it as a crutch.
Bring up the SWU
calculator.
And so, while you look this up, just a bit of commentary for me. There does seem to be this chicken and an egg phenomenon in terms of scaling up reactors that require HALEU or TRISO. Being, you need to have a big order book and hopefully have a bunch of them going and producing power to generate the demand, which leads to the investment in the facilities to bring the massive cost down to something that's affordable. But it all hinges on, again, having the demand, having the reactors out there. And so obviously there's a role for government maybe to get in and get moving on funding some of this TRISO and HALEU production. But it's a bit of a gamble.
Yeah, it may not ever. It may not ever be certain. Depends on like what market you want to help. Like if you're just looking at fringe high diesel cost areas or military places, then sure, it may be worth working on that to get that to work. But if you're talking about commoditized, world scale electricity production, like there's a much bigger question about like even if you got all those fuel costs down to whatever UO2 costs, the SWU, the amount of SWU and feed uranium and enrichment you need is going to be like intractably expensive from fuel cycle alone, even if your reactors are free. And so that's like a major challenge that people have to kind of deal with. And there's issues we didn't like. I think most people kind of know what TRISO fuel is, but like TRISO fuel is this like incredible thing that allows you to, it holds all the fission products in these little particles that are super robust and can go to very high temperature. But they have like 5% the heavy metal density of uranium oxide. So like when in terms of like when you're a neutron and you're flying around, there's 5% the uranium available. Like you're bouncing off graphite and silicon carbide way more. I mean, literally 20 times more than in just regular old uranium oxide. And that's, it's just the geometry of it. If you're a little particle fuel and you've got all these coating layers on you, well, that's in fact, that's an eighth right there. And then you have a packing fraction where the particles themselves are embedded in either a pebble or a compact. And that packing fraction might be another factor of 2/3 or whatever, like that. And so now you have like a very low heavy metal density that just totally diminishes your neutronics capabilities. So now you need to max out your enrichment. So you're all up at HALEU, which you got the big premium on, and you're not as neutronically efficient. So as you're running through that fuel, you could take it to high burnup if you had enough enrichment to carry it through. But like the amount of uranium you're burning, the amount of neutrons that are getting wasted by either leakage or just getting captured in the structure is pretty significant. So like, well, TRISO is it's like a miracle. Like it's a super cool fuel concept. The idea of it becoming economical on sort of a commoditized market as opposed to in very fringe applications is a significant challenge.
Okay, were you able to find that number in terms of the all-in cost for?
No, I found it's like $100 a SWU and $110 a kilogram for the feed uranium. So, but then you have to add it all up, and I didn't do it.
So we've talked a bit about containment and shielding as being challenges that make this. Again, if we can sort of make our list of like, how is this different than a diesel generator? We've talked about shielding, which is a big one. And you mentioned sort of even if you kind of bury it in a whole bunch of earth, you can activate that earth to some degree.
Yeah, sorry. And let me just dive in there. So like, this, like if like a few neutrons leak out, I mean, it can't be like 99.9. It has to be like 100% because like at PM3A, they backfilled earth around the reactor vessel. But like, oops, that volcanic rock had some sodium. It was high sodium. It has chlorine. When neutrons go into rock, they activate. They make radioactive things. So like the sodium in the rock activated to sodium-24. And then they air cooled it because it was getting hot, and the air gets activated to, there's argon in the air, gets activated to argon-41. Chlorine in rock gets activated to chlorine-36, which is a 300,000 year half-life. And so like what they ended up having to do once they pulled that reactor out, it's kind of a special case because Antarctica, that you're not allowed to dispose of radioactive waste because of the treaties. Well, they had to barge tons and tons and tons of sediment from around where that reactor was because of this activation to like California. And then the Californians like, you can't put it here. And so they had to like barge it somewhere else. So the logistical nightmare that came out of that is just it's a thing you don't really think of. It's like, oh shoot, we activated a little bit of material. Normally you would just bury it, but like depending on where you are or who cares, and how well you were shielded, you may end up having to deal with all this like activation. You can get carbon-14, tritium, all sorts of stuff. It's a real pain in the ass.
Okay, so we've talked shielding. We're talking fuel cost. I think another big one is again operations and maintenance, and in terms of what killed the sort of first microreactor renaissance. That seems to be a big part of it. I mean, that being said, these were PWRs, active cooling systems. You needed dedicated staff on site. We've got big leaps now, I think, in automation and maybe remote operation. And some of the designs, like reading into this stuff, like I probably come across, and maybe I am a bit of a bloody pessimist. I blame it on my Eastern European background, but maybe you have something that's truly, low or no maintenance, and that can operate for these long cycles, deals with we're going to talk probably a little bit as well about the fuel handling, actually removing spent fuel from these smaller reactors, particularly the ones that aren't water cooled. Having been to Henderson B in the UK and seen how they defueled the advanced gas reactors. I mean, it's tricky when you're not doing that underwater. Water is such a great radiation shield. So let's talk a little bit about operations maintenance. Let's talk about heat pipes. Okay. This is not a micro. This is a macro episode here. So
that's fine. I mean, it's true. Like again, in the final report for like PM1, they had 40 outages, like unplanned outages at the radar site because of the reactor shut down unexpectedly, and like half of those were because the nuclear plant did something goofy, and half that the steam plant did something goofy, and they had 25 people full time, different shifts of 25 people, 2 officers and 25 enlisted to like just keep that thing up and running. And they were like, this is ridiculous. Like the amount of maintenance we have to do on this is absolutely a showstopper. You need to make reactors that are way lower maintenance. And in fact, they said in the PM1 final summary, they were like, you might want to consider something. You better make steam plants way more reliable or come up with something simpler and lower maintenance. And so heat pipes, I mean, certainly are a step in that direction. I mean, heat pipes are sort of they're passive heat transfer mechanisms. And we can talk about, I know you asked earlier, like what the hell is a heat pipe, or one of your followers asked that. So we can talk about that. But yeah, it certainly is a step in the right direction in terms of simplicity, probably lower maintenance. And of course, I mean, eventually there's numerous heat pipe based reactors, but it is just like a heat transfer pathway. It doesn't make electricity. So you're still taking that heat, you're pulling it out of the core, and then you're still doing something. You're transferring that heat to something else, some kind of power cycle that's going to make the electricity. So like eventually transfers that heat to like an air Brayton cycle. So they move the heat from the reactor out here, and then have like a jet engine that's heated by that heat. Other people, you could go to other options. You can go straight to a Stirling engine. You could go to like thermocouples, thermionic conversion, which we've done. I mean, we have the reactor in space, which we didn't talk about. SNAP 10A went straight to like a thermionic power conversion. Anyway, so I guess let me talk about heat pipes just briefly, if that makes sense now. So you've got a heat pipe in your laptop. They're in phones. They're like cool little passive devices that move heat from one place to another. And basically, they're just like a tube, and they have some kind of usually like a liquid metal vapor in there. So I think of like sodium vapor, and they have like a wick. So the wick can either be just like sitting at the bottom or on one side of the tube, or it can be like an annular wick that goes through the whole thing. And basically, what happens is you get like the liquid metal or whatever your working fluid is sort of evaporates at the heated section and becomes vapor, and then it sort of just passively goes down to the other side where you're pulling the heat out, the cold side, and then that condenses into the wick, and then it transports through capillary action or sometimes gravity assist back to the other side where it evaporates again. And so you have this. It's basically an engineered material that is like an extremely high thermal conductivity tube. And so it's cool because you don't necessarily have to run your coolant into your core directly where it's going to get irradiated and it's going to have high pressure or whatever. You can transfer that heat of the core right on out and then do your coolant, your secondary system over there. So that's definitely a cool simplification. There are limits. That there's plenty of limits, like based on that physical process I mentioned. Like you can there's if you heat it up too much, you dry out, like all your vapor or all your liquid metal goes to vapor, and then the heat transfer completely stops. And there's a bunch of other limits. So they're generally limited to very small, low power things. And the ones in your laptop are taking heat from your CPU, taking it over to the little fan, and then going back to the CPU. So they're little copper snaky things in there. But you're not running a big reactor off of this. But for microreactors, it's pretty good. So like eventually, at least this estimate, again, people should publish stuff, but like it would have like 1,000 heat pipes in there. So it's like fuel pin, heat pipe, fuel pin, heat pipe, fuel pin, heat pipe, that kind of thing. So you have lots of these things in there. And they have been irradiated before. So back in EBR2, this is kind of indirect, but we do have a radiation experience where there were like 29 of them that were used as like temperature control on one of the test specimens that was in the experimental breeder reactor 2. And they were irradiated for like thousands of hours. And one of them failed, but no big deal. Like the robustness of them is pretty solid. Like they should withstand, and those are fast neutrons. They should withstand neutron damage and corrosion issues for a couple years, which is what the microreactors want to do anyway. So they're a good fit, and we do have some actual radiation experience with them. So that's the basics of a heat pump or a heat pipe. And so that certainly could be a tool to help us move into this more sort of passive and simple system. And if you do that to like a straight up a no maintenance power conversion cycle, like a thermocouple thing, then there you go. You've got like a totally maintenance-free system. And that's, again, what we used in space, where no one's doing maintenance anyway. But the efficiency of those are super low. So you lose the vast majority of your heat, and you can't convert it to electricity. And then the midpoint is like a Stirling engine, which is what Krusty was used. And those are more like an engine. They're higher efficiency, and they're also pretty low maintenance. They may need some maintenance, but they're like a lot lower maintenance than like a steam plant.
And that was I just love the acronym here, Kilo Power Reactor using Stirling technology. And I don't know if it's too simplistic to say eVinci is just scaling that up. I'm sure there's a lot of detailed design engineering which diverges in lots of ways, but Krusty operated, I think, 28 hours at full power, and was 1/1000th the power output, 5 kilowatts versus 5 megawatts from eVinci. And this is where, I think there's this quote. James was talking to me about this, and he was like, the problem here, I mean, this is all super cool technology, but the way that it's being commercialized is, science experiments that are kind of like masquerading as commercial products. And that this is a great area. It's fascinating. We should continue working on it. But we're in this sort of, again, chicken and the egg situation where like you almost need to hype it and maybe oversell it and overpromise in order to get the investment, whether that's VC or government, and to develop the technology further. But there is this huge delta and gap between actually getting the operational experience to say, are we going to get the capacity factors we're looking for? Will eventually deliver on its promise of being simple, fairly maintenance-free technology? We won't know that until we actually operate it, not for 28 hours like Krusty did at full power, but, for a decade. And I think that's a real challenge here, both for getting the demand and supply of fuel figured out, and for, just getting the engineering and reactor development figured out.
Yeah, I'm like conflicted on this. I mean, yeah, and Krusty, I mean, it's fuel. Again, if you just assume ATU is the same as LEU, SWU for SWU, that's over $1 million of fuel for like a 100 kilowatt generator. A 100 kilowatt generator is $15,000 that you can tow behind your truck. So like the fuel cost for Krusty is like truly absurd. Again, even if the reactor were free, it's like a total non-starter because of fuel for anything. But I mean, they're talking about space applications where sure, you can pay a factor of 1,000 more for your energy, because it totally makes sense there. But yeah, this issue, it's interesting because like on one hand, small and microreactors are probably the coolest and cheapest way to do reactor development and get hands-on experience operating real reactors and build back up that group of people who really know how to run reactors, know what kind of real problems they come in, get through the Rickover paper memo to like, I am running reactors and I know all the problems that I see. Like, and microreactors are a good deal in terms of like dollars per how much operating experience you get. Like, it's great. And so, I mean, and the US, the Atomic Energy Commission used to fund them, and now don't, at least as much. I mean, they still do through various programs, but nothing like we saw in the 50s and 60s when we had dozens of small reactors up and running, all funded by the government. But now, like you said, VCs are in. Like, VCs hear the potential capabilities, people hype it up and do those cool renders with the truck driving off, and VCs are throwing in millions and millions of dollars. Like just the other day, one of the microreactor companies announced $30 million raise. Like, congrats to them. And these are like friends of mine. And it's awesome. And the VCs, it's a big group of VCs who are like, we want to invest in revolutionary climate related energy tech. And when you come forth with these kind of capabilities, they're like, I'm in. Like, I want to put money in. I know it's risky, but like, let's shake it down. So, I mean, I'm certainly conflicted. I kind of agree that, like when you go to their websites and try to do the economic analysis and like give a true estimate of like what the economic viability, even if you make very conservative assumptions, like it would be nice if it was like, hey, look, this is going to be at best case 20 times more expensive than this diesel generator. But if but that makes sense in these scenarios. I think that would feel better. And maybe that's what's happening. Like, I know, like Rod Adams always says, like, oh, you better believe these people are doing their due diligence. And that's partially true. But on the other hand, doing due diligence as a VC is challenging in an advanced nuclear company. You really do need to have even advanced nuclear people who can come in and sit down and listen to what they're saying and then build the simulations and fill in the gaps and be like, this is what the actual performance looks like, or get them to like tell you the actual performance. Again, we should set up a thing where like you're expected to fill in this little form that says, all your fuel cycle, all the information you need for your fuel cycle knowledge, so that we can all just do like head-to-head comparisons, so that we can compete realistically based on facts, as opposed to based on like who's got the best marketing people and who's the most connected, who has the coolest board and all that kind of thing.
So we talked about sort of operations and reliability, and man, I mean, each of these little subtopics could be an hour-long discussion. But I mean, I do find myself, again, I'm romanced by the heat pipes without knowing very much about them. But looking at HDGR and sodium fast reactor concepts, which are going to run for 10 or 20 years, presumably, or if we're to believe the claims of the vendors, presumably fairly maintenance free because of the challenges of maintenance in remote locations, and also shielding limitations that make maintenance hard, et cetera. And also activated sodium and things like that we've discussed before. Those seem to be potentially pretty buggy. Like if we look at the record of HDGRs, frankly, capacity factors have sucked.
Yeah.
And it's been not fun. Like the percentage time you're online, it sounds like you're sort of like, on the edge of your seat. And again, we have commercial sodium reactor fleet in one country alone in Russia, and God bless them, but it's tricky. So maybe we'll park that, but let's talk a little bit again, because I think just thinking about, again, getting back to that basic category error, how are these different than diesel generators? You burn off your fuel in a diesel generator, it turns into some particulate and CO2, which is a problem, but actually getting the spent fuel handling, I find that fascinating, because I've been on a gantry moving spent fuel around a spent fuel pool. But I can get my head around that. And in my little spiel, when people ask me, is nuclear waste dangerous? I say absolutely, hell yes. But like, it's not as complex as aviation safety, for instance. Moving fuel underwater, moving it through this channel to a primary bay and a secondary bay, and then putting it underwater into a steel cask. Pretty simple. But again, I guess focusing on the sort of non-water based, because it sounds like
even though sorry.
It sounds complicated. So, what do you think some of the challenges are, particularly with microreactors? And I think eVinci's getting around this by, we're just going to take the whole reactor. Again, shielding may be a problem here, but take the whole irradiated reactor and fuel and move it back to a central facility. That seems elegant to me to try and partially solve that.
That's basically the plan they all have, is like, okay, we will come pick up the reactor, we'll ship it back in a full, just shipping high level waste around that's been in the spent fuel pool for years is a major logistical challenge. Like, it's always like you're driving real slow and you have to close down all the railroads and all sorts of stuff. But so they're going to just come in, they're going to pick up that reactor, and different companies have different, times that they do this. Maybe it's every 4 years, truck shows up, hauls off your reactor. They take it to a central facility where they basically can install it in a shielded well, and they have the remote control operations that can go in. It doesn't have to be underwater. Sometimes you could even fill it in with water if it's compatible with your reactor. But anyway, you can do it remotely through like a big hot cell. And there's plenty of experience going way back of using big robot arms that can come in and tear apart like those HTRE reactors are sitting in the parking lot. Those old airplane reactors at Idaho National Lab, they had a whole facility that would like go in there and open those up and refuel them and stuff. So like it would just be stuff like that. And then once you refuel it or you replace the module, you truck it back up to the person. So there's going to be, the idea is that like, instead of every day bringing in diesel, or every year that, bringing in a huge boat full of diesel, then every 4 years or whatever, you're just getting rid of your power plant for a while, how long it'll take, at least weeks, and then waiting for it to get refueled and then coming back. So you may have to have like 2 of them if you want continuous power, or they could do a hot swap. They may come in and drop another one off and grab the old one and swap it back. So like, that's a thing you could do. That probably will get challenging logistically. You may need 2 trucks or whatever, because like one's going to need a lot of shielding if it's fresh fuel or whatever. Oklo plans on reprocessing the fuel. So they're going to go in and get it. They're going to bring it back, or at least bring the fuel back. And then they're going to have their own corporate reprocessing system. And they're going to reprocess that fuel, refabricate it, and ship back recycled fuel. They're the fast reactor of the crew. So they can do like breeding while they're at it. So that's interesting. But yeah, they all kind of do something like that. And that's certainly a lot different than diesel. I mean, again, it's the logistical challenge of shipping either, uranium fuel or especially spent nuclear fuel is very significant. And that cost, and the logistical challenge that has to be factored in, that's a major disadvantage over just like bringing in a truck of diesel.
And to make that work economically, it infers that you need a big fleet to again justify. I mean, this is the SMR thing: is you need if you're going to do this more and more in factories, then you need a huge order book to justify building the multi-billion-dollar factory. Similarly, if you're going to be doing the spent fuel reprocessing in Oklo's case, or just the handling at a centralized facility, this gets complicated in a way that a gigawatt scale nuclear plant, it's complicated, but you can see a pathway towards that being a smaller chunk of the LCOE, for instance.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, you definitely would need you'd certainly want a big fleet for this to make sense, especially like the reprocessing plant. But yes, to build that big facility and service it and get enough revenue, you need lots of customers. And again, not to dwell on it too much, but even if the reactors were free, you still have that fuel to buy. And if the fuel, even if you build 1 million reactors from nothing, if that fuel cost is still absurd, you have no solution. That's something I think is lost. It's like, oh, we'll just do factory production. It solves the economic problems. Like, no, because you have to buy the fuel, and the fuel is crazy expensive. And you have to buy it up front. And so that's just, that's just coming back to it.
That's where, again, I see, niche applications, for instance, naval propulsion. There's no alternative that I can think of. For the idea of for remote applications where diesel fuel costs are super challenging, or we want to save soldiers' lives in terms of transport of fuel in war zones, okay, that's a niche application. It seems justifiable. But the idea, and I've had people sort of try and sell me on this of, okay, we have a gigawatt scale data center, we're going to power it with 200 5-megawatt reactors. That starts to get a little bit into crazy town for me in terms of, unless I'm missing something major here. Because the thing is, well, the whole problem with nuclear is construction cost. Therefore, move it into a factory. If we can do it all in a factory, then maybe this is a more viable way to do it. But I think what you've just explained to us is, if they were free, you still have these huge challenges.
The neutronic constraints that are geometric in nature cannot be overcome by factory production. You will never be able to make a neutronically efficient tiny reactor that, if you just build a bunch of them, is cheap. Because what you'll end up doing is you'll end up bringing them all close together, so the neutrons that leak out of one go into the other, and pretty soon you have a big reactor like that. That is a key fundamental neutronics issue that I don't care how many factories and how much modularization you've done, you're not getting around that. It's a truly geometric issue.
Nick, you've just innovated something that we actually have in Canada, which is a micro modular reactor. We just put all of our pressure tube modules inside of a calandria, and we capture those neutrons between the different So exactly. Nick, absolutely brilliant. You've caught up with the Canadians.
We'll have to give it a catchy name. Give something.
I love can-do. I just like can-do attitude.
Yeah, they're great.
All right, I think we're like nearing the end here. There's a few other sort of like fixed costs. Again, in terms of how is a microreactor different than a diesel generator? I don't need to have a bunch of security guards, for instance.
And we didn't mention licensing. Like, licensing is a huge one that we didn't even cover. Like, you're going to need a design cert. It's going to be 250 million, and then you're going to need to sell like 250 reactors just to break even on licensing. So like, there is the licensing and regulatory regime, and people are working on this and talking to regulators. If it's smaller, there's less risk of number of radionuclides coming out. But even a small reactor, SL1, a tiny little reactor, didn't have major radiological consequences off-site, so it's like low on the the list of horrible nuclear accidents. But it was a brutal and horrible accident, and like did release a ton of melted all the fuel, released tons of radiation, and so like that's obviously not. We can't just go messing around with reactors because they're small because of things like SL1. So you still have a strict regulatory regime. Obviously, you can make reactors safer than SL1. We learned lots of lessons from that, and things like TRISO fuel do help with that, and Triga fuel and so on. But the licensing and regulatory costs are huge as well. So I just wanted to throw that in there while you're saying things we missed.
And again, this comes back to economies of scale work, because you have a certain particular nuclear, because you have a whole bunch of fixed costs, licensing, security, fuel handling, shielding, etc. And those all become smaller percentages of the overall cost when you have a great big reactor.
Yeah, that's true. Yep, but big reactors also like are super expensive and can bankrupt whole
Yeah.
utilities. So I mean,
Yes. Yes. Yes.
I'm excited about the possibility of microreactors, especially for like advancing the technology, getting the cool, excellent operational experience, and being put in fringe locations. And I think like a lot of these companies have a strategy, right? That's like let's build a little cheap reactor in a very fringe market to get our feet wet, to get started on it, and then given as we like bootstrap our knowledge and our experience, like sure we'll make a bigger one and then we'll make a bigger one and we'll be actual nuclear experts, will be up and running. And so there is a reasonable path. Like I am excited, like if you can find people willing to fund microreactor development for some purpose that they're interested in, that's not wasted. Like that's going to push the envelope in science, it's going to give people operational experience, and it lays the groundwork to scale up in a different direction as needed if you're going to a more commoditized market. So like I am a fan of these. I'm excited that people are working on these. But yeah, like I don't think we should go around talking about powering data centers with a bunch of little tiny reactors, but that doesn't mean that microreactors in general are not worth
Yeah, this
pursuing.
is not a niche application. Just, I guess, fuel economy has become like shielding, but fuel economy, I think, and fuel cost, have been such a big driver in this conversation. Um, uh, could you get down to a 10 or 20 megawatt reactor using LEU? Is there some way to get the core geometry right, or what does
Yeah.
it mean in terms of like your impacts on refueling
I mean,
timeframes?
yeah,
Or
it comes down to economics. You can take an AP 1000 and run it at 1 watt for thousands of years, right? Like you can run a nuclear reactor at any power you want. You can set any power you want and it'll just run at that point for longer. So if you have a 50 megawatt reactor that runs for 4 years, you can run it at 25 megawatts for 8 years. Like that's just a conservation. There's a certain amount of energy you can get out. It doesn't matter how long you take. So you can adjust power and duration to literally, I mean, anything. There's power cycle issues, but so yeah, you can definitely make an LEU reactor. It's really big, and we call it down rated. So if it's running at a power that's below what its heat removal capability is, that would be a down rated reactor. And yeah, you can absolutely do that. You will run into corrosion issues at some point. At some point, like time at temperature will cause corrosion, and that'll get you. But the bigger issue is this thing we were talking about earlier about that the upfront cost of that fuel has a time value associated with it. And so it's almost always better from like an LCOE perspective or just like a civilization value. If you're going to put in $50 million of fuel, you're going to want to get a lot of money fast out of it as opposed to a little tiny bit of money forever. Like that just doesn't make sense. Because if you took the charge, again, the money that you spent on that $50 million of fuel and threw it in the stock market, like that's what you're competing against. And so, yeah.
I guess, like in terms of again the different categories, the Army nuclear power program, the research reactors, and then the prototypes that proved out things like the way that Windscale did for the AGR, or Calder Hall did for Magnox, or I'm trying to again show off here, Borax did for the BWRs.
Yeah.
Like
Nice.
some of those reactors used LEU or natural uranium with very small cores. So I guess the question I have specifically is something like, say, Last Energy 20 megawatt PWR. What are the neutronic challenges there in terms of there's not many of the military style obviously that ran on LEU, but can you do a small PWR on LEU, or what are the potential
Yeah, you
challenges
can.
there?
I mean, yeah, you can take a couple assemblies of LEU and it'll go critical. It doesn't take much, but so the big issue there is just like how long will it go critical? So like you can and the rate of your activity reduction is proportional to your power as well. Like if you're pulling more power out, the reactivity goes down faster. But if you have just a few assemblies and you're a really low power reactor, then you're going to run out of ability to sustain a chain reaction before you've extracted enough energy out of your fuel to reach like what your fuel burnup limits are, which is LWR shut down because they build up too much fission products, they run out of uranium, and the fuel themselves has like too much fission gas pressure in the pellets, that is going to, there's limits on fuel performance. So well, if you just make a small reactor that just barely goes critical and you run it for a very low burnup, then okay, you can do it, but you just wasted all that fuel. Like if you go reprocess the fuel, like maybe that would be reasonable if you're just pulling out like 1% of the energy every time you run your reactor. But really, but that's a cost. You then have to pay to reprocess your fuel. So you're leaving money on the table by running your fuel to burnups that are lower than what that same fuel could have pulled out in a larger reactor. So like if you want to leave money on the table, you can do that. But we're in a situation in nuclear in general where we don't want to be leaving money on the table.
But I guess that gets you around the extraordinary high costs of things like TRISO and HEU. So you could make an argument there that you'll use fuel less efficiently, but maybe because of factory fabrication, you can build these things a bit faster. Like maybe there's a kind of sweet spot there, or are you refueling going to be every 6 months because of low use?
It could be every month. I mean, I don't know. Like it could be. But yeah, I mean, there's definitely like that's worth exploring, and that can be like optimized with like a very simple, fuel cycle cost versus reactor size model that we could all sit down and look at. And just the neutronics are pretty well known. So, like, yeah, there is a trade off that can be made there. And I mean, there's the other one, deep fission, right, where they take LWR assemblies and drop them down boreholes and just bring them critical, is like another fun idea, and people are exploring this kind of thing. And like, yeah, they get super low burnup, but is it worth it? Because you don't need a reactor. So, these are interesting questions, and it's good that people are out messing around with them. I just think that like it would be better if we could throw, again, those fuel cycle economics all in a spreadsheet and look at them side by side, just, and make sure that the VCs or the government that's investing in them knows upfront like what it looks like, sort of, even if the reactor were free based on fuel cycle costs. I think that's just like a very important thing to consider. But yeah, using UO2 in a small reactor, even a downrated reactor, that might be the best idea. Like that's a really cool idea. In fact, like all this, the safety advantages of TRISO, that it's not going to melt down. Well, you can do that with uranium oxide if you run it at very low power. So you could take, and I have friends who are obsessed with this idea, like build a light water reactor that's small and run it way downrated so that if there's any, an outage, you don't even need a diesel generator because the amount of decay heat is so small that like whatever, it just naturally circulates and conducts out just like in a TRISO or a TRISO reactor. So like that could be done, and that may be the best option. And
it has been done. Back to Canada, man. The Slowpoke, baby.
Right,
we built
the Slowpoke.
University of Toronto, Sherbrooke. I think out east we got one, and Jamaica and Mexico.
Yeah,
we have
how many watts? Wasn't those? That's a quarter of a watt.
20 kilowatts.
Oh, really? I thought it was like a quarter of a watt. But okay.
No, 20 kilowatts.
Oh, nice.
It's respectable.
Yeah. That's good.
All right. I feel like again, each of these subtopics we could go into for an hour, but we're probably dredging right now. Any sort of final closing thoughts? Anything we didn't get a chance to touch on? I think this is such a historically and technically fascinating.
No, yeah. Thanks for having the talk. We didn't talk about radioisotopic thermal generators, which are another like competition area in this thing, which just use radioactive decay to power things. That's another sort of competition in this space, but that's fine. But no, yeah, this was great fun. I think we covered a lot, and I hope people enjoyed it. Thanks for having me on.
All right, Nick. So shielding, fuel cost, fuel handling, licensing, security. There's some challenges.
Yeah.
Staffing, operations, maintenance, shielding. Okay, we'll leave it there. Nick, thanks again. Sobering but exciting. Great having you on. And thanks for making the time.
Yeah, of course. Take care.
Cheers.